So I put this together because I do think that this film, more than the others that we have analyzed, and of course we've been going through as far mostly in terms of story structure and story analysis on all of our different films, but this one, more than any of the other ones, even though we have said that all the films are products of their time, they're made for the audience at the time, they're often trying to say things for that time, we have largely, I would say largely, not completely, but largely analyzed them without necessarily that context because it's just the story structure. But here, this movie, I think, deserves an analysis in the context of the chronology of other things that are going around because it is so much a movie of its time. So in 1966, the original Star Trek original series began, and that ran until 1969. So there was a huge gap. It was a 10-year gap between that TV show and this movie. So we're talking about the 60s to the 70s. And also, this movie is definitely very 70s in general. I mean,
yeah.
So we're height of 70s here because, it was in production before, it came out in 79, but it was in production all throughout the...
There's some good disco vibes in those uniforms they wear.
Disco vibes in the uniforms, the carpeting and the of the Enterprise and all of that. But 1968, I mean, it's pretty... Oh, I actually have that out of chronological order. But 2001, A Space Odyssey came out in 1968. And I think you really have to understand this film, the motion picture, in the context of A Space Odyssey.
Yeah. In fact, one of the debates that I heard from behind the scenes was the director, Robert Wise, is really a director from the era or the generation of Kubrick and that. And one of the discussions they were having is, should we go with an experienced director like Robert Wise, who might be in the tradition of 2001: A Space Odyssey, or should we try to shift to someone more young and new, like a George Lucas, who adds the speed to the show? And you see which way they went. And some people have debated that the choice of Robert Wise may have clashed a little bit with the timing of the release, which I think is interesting.
Well, it could have, because it's also, so it's more than 10 years after, A Space Odyssey. But it's still so much influenced by it. And then Star Wars had come out in 1977. And of course, we had a comment over here that they were thinking about doing another Star Trek TV show. And
they were?
Yeah, they were going to do Star Trek Phase 2. Huh. And so a lot of these sets had been designed for Star Trek Phase 2. They had been cast. Okay, I didn't know you didn't know that. So we can mention that. And I don't know the entire chronology, but they were going to bring Star Trek back to TV, and it was going to be called Star Trek Phase 2. And so they were writing scripts for that. They had everybody on board except for Leonard Nimoy.
Mm-hmm. I heard he was a stickler even for the movie.
And then they, because of the influence of Star Wars came out, was this big thing. Like, wait a minute, do we continue to go with a TV show or do we turn this into a movie? So they turned that into the motion picture, that Star Wars Phase 2 into Star Trek, the motion picture. And then I do think it's interesting that just a year later, Empire Strikes Back came out.
That, it's almost hard to believe people living back. And I was alive back then, but I don't remember. Can you imagine going to the theater one year and there's Star Trek, the motion picture, and then the next year there's Empire Strikes Back, and then there's Raiders of the Lost Ark. I mean, we were completely spoiled and had no idea.
Right. Yeah, it's a different style of film that's sitting there right in the middle of all of this. Mm-hmm. And then also 1987, Star Trek: The Next Generation came out. I was looking at that gap too, because there's a lot of influence from Star Trek: The Motion Picture to The Next Generation,
including the music. Right?
As soon as you hear the music, you're like, "Whoa, what's?" Oh, so
I was going to say too. One thing that I found super interesting in terms of dates, I looked it up at the last second. Star Trek: The original series ended June 3rd, 1969. And the lunar landing occurred July 20th, 1969. So it's like within 45 days of the Star Trek series ending, the Apollo 11 mission completed its mission on the moon, which is crazy. I mean, there's this huge... They should have held on for just a little bit longer.
right.
They could have got a fourth season at least.
Well, when I watched this movie yesterday, and then I watched it with the commentary that I forget who was all in the commentary, but with like a Kuda, who is part of a lot of Star Trek, and then also Star Trek lore and history. And they were saying that if you're taking a look at different, and I agreed with this, that if you're taking a look at different benchmarks in Star Trek history, obviously Star Trek existing as the motion picture, but then it didn't exist. Star Trek existing as the original series, but then it didn't exist for a long time. And how could we possibly bring this back? Can Star Trek be reestablished? The motion picture is another huge landmark, and that it can make the jump. It can still keep going. It can make the jump to the silver screen and become something new again. And then, of course, the next generation that we get this back to TV. So there's an influence from the motion picture in the next generation. Sets, some of the characters, the music, the hallways in the Enterprise look the same. And I didn't realize that when you look at engineering, it's a redress of the Enterprise A set.
Oh, really?
Yeah. You know that in the next generation, they have that elevator in that like one person clear elevator.
Oh yeah.
That's in Star Trek 1. Like Kirk comes down it. And so stuff shift around and stuff like that, but it's so the influence of this movie is felt all over the place.
Well, yeah, it's interesting too, because I watched it again last night too, and I got to be honest, a lot of people are a little down on Star Trek the motion picture. The older I get, the more I really have started to love this movie. I really appreciate it. I'm a much bigger fan than most people are of Star Trek the motion picture. And one of the little games I played, similar to what you just said, was I tried to look for what carried over, because it's such a orphan of the Star Trek world in terms of the look and the sets and the costume designs. So I was like, it stands alone. It's not the original series uniforms. It's not Star Trek 2 and 3 and 4 and really, the maroon military fatigues that they started switching to. So I was like, well, what carried over? And I didn't catch the glass elevator. I found three main things. One was the Starship Enterprise design itself. That didn't really change much from 1 to 2 to 3 to 4 to 5. And to me, that's the classic Enterprise. That one in the first, I guess from 1 through 6. That Enterprise is the Enterprise I grew up with and loved. That to me, that's one of the most beautiful ships, ever that they've captured. But I also noticed 2, the Admiralty uniform that Kirk wears in Star Trek 1. That has survived all the way even into the J.J. Abrams films, that Admiralty uniform, the white and the gray. And then finally, Spock's robe. It's shown, he's wearing it when he arrives on the Enterprise. That becomes pretty iconic for Star Trek 3 after Spock passes away, but he's also wearing it in Star Trek 2 while he meditates. So the Spock robe started in Star Trek 1, the motion picture, and it went on to kind of become rather symbolic of Spock himself. So those are the big 3 that I saw that I was like, okay, they didn't really change the look of the Enterprise at all. They stuck with the Admiralty uniform and Spock's robe. All came from Star Trek, the motion picture. I thought that was interesting.
Yeah, I guess last year or something, I went through and I rewatched all of the Star Trek original movies because I had them on VHS as a kid. They were my prized possession. I had the box where it had the Enterprise on the sides. They all slid together and made the Enterprise flying at you. Oh yeah, and those were one of my prized possessions. I watched those all the time, and I appreciated them a lot more by going through and listening to some of the director's commentary and understanding because you're trying to build this universe and trying to tell this consistent story in the face of business and everything else that's going on from the studio perspective. And when you're like, why was this done this way? Or why did this not come out right? I'm talking about overall with the whole, you're also trying to do it in the context of business, and they did get to leave up. They said it was highly unusual, but that Paramount let them maintain these sets on a stage for a long time, which is why they ended up getting reused and redressed. And you see elements from this movie that reappear.